Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about this solely in the context of disasters, so that you guys have some background. Again, we're not trying to be political here, but as I mentioned before, that these past 12 months have been quite different, and this is objectively a real challenge for us. Okay, so let's start talking about a little bit of the context here of our modern world. And most of our modern management world really stems from World War II. So the immediate wake of World War II and the decades immediately following that really set up our modern organization and norms and behaviors and things like that in the United States. And so in the wake of World War II, once we come back, one of the first things we do is we start to really emphasize science, and we really emphasize the federal injecting of large amounts of money into the enterprise of science, particularly universities, basic research, applied research as well, NIH and things like that, but really this idea of science is good. And this was really driven to a large extent by the Cold War, right? So there was this fear that, quote unquote, the enemy was getting better than we were, and so we need to keep up. And the way we're going to keep up is we're going to provide resources for folks, for educators to do the education, resources for folks to learn, et cetera. And science was a key foundation of that. And for the longest time, this was bipartisan. Sure, some party or some politician has a view about this or that, and sometimes the numbers go up or down, but broadly speaking, this was in strong agreement, and that science, that objective looking at reality, gave us all kinds of benefits, right? So we determined, hey, is the wood shingle roof better or worse for dealing with wildfires versus a slate roof, right? And using science, we found, the wood shake roof is more risky, right? Is more likely to catch fire, that kind of stuff. And so there was all kinds of benefits for our economy, for how we were getting better with being more resistant to a disaster in the first place, and then when it did happen, resilient once the impact sort of played out. All manner of research has shown there's massive ROI, or return on investment. So when we put in $1, or when the federal government, let's say in this case, invests $1, we get more than $1 benefit. Now, it's not always super clear, right? So for example, sometimes it's in reduced healthcare expenditure. Sometimes it's in reduced or lack of days missed of work. And there's many different ways to measure it. But however you do go about measuring it, the return on investment is quite high. In the context of federal disaster funding in particular, we have, on the order of a 50% increase to three times increase in terms of what we get back. And so that's a long way of saying that investments in federal science, particularly investments in federal disaster-related science, have a clear societal benefit and a clear governmental benefit. In the wake of that World War II era, we also began to establish some norms, and these were things like we have a shared reality that when we say the lightning strikes 10 times, we say, yep, the lightning struck 10 times, that kind of stuff. That if you live in this particular corridor, you're more likely to be whacked by a tornado. And yes, we all agree that this area is Tornado Alley and things of that nature. So we might call that an objectivist view, that this is true no matter who's looking at it. It's just the world as it is. We also came to expect expert independence. So people that understood the wildfire, that understood the earthquake or whatever, particularly the technical folks, were good. It didn't matter what their background was. Didn't matter if they're rich or poor or whatever. If they're a technical person, if they're a scientist, they're gonna say the facts, as the facts are, and everybody basically accepted that. We would only, and then related to that, the classic one everybody talks about is something like the DMV or something. Like you roll in the DMV, and it's like, oh my God, people here are so sluggish. Why does it take so long to get my thing, right? There are of course, folks, offices, divisions, whatever, that maybe aren't the most efficient, shall we say, in government, to be sure. But by and large, the folks that I've known over my careers, the government scientists, the government managers, they're mostly fantastic people, and they are not slugs. They are not lame. They are not like they are sometimes portrayed in the media as these sort of people that can't get a job anywhere else. I've found these folks to be very technically competent and very worried about spending money efficiently and following the law and all that kind of stuff. And so, in other words, we've had independence of these experts, right? So that when they work for an agency, they're not bringing their political affiliations. Sometimes I'm sure people do, but by and large, these folks work hard, in my experience, to be calling a spade and that kind of stuff. And that because of that, we have these civil service, this approach to civil service that those folks, if they're doing something corrupt, if they're being massively inefficient, whatever the case may be, they can be fired, but fired for cause. Fired because they did something lame or something inappropriate. And as a consequence of this great emphasis on objectivity, on rigor, on well-funding in terms of our understanding of these systems, we came to have a dominant global leadership role, not just in the U.S., but across the planet, and that's both in public health and in things like disaster response. So that was our heritage in the wake of World War II. So we'll go through this really quickly, but here's a quick little cartoon timeline. I'm simplifying it for you guys here, but basically, in the wake of World War II, there's various groups across the federal government that start to do some elements that influence disasters, either the planning for disasters, the response to the disasters, whatever. But they're kind of in this office over here and in that agency over there, and some are in this building and some are in this other state and all that kind of stuff. So essentially, the first sort of magnet of trying to pull several of those ideas together and be sort of something of a one-stop shop happened in 1975 under the Housing and Urban Development Agency, and that lasted for a couple years. And then President Carter's administration did a study about how could we deal with disasters better, and they came up with a plan. And then he generated an executive order that established the Federal Emergency Management Agency in 1979. And so so again, first in 1975 in HUD, and then really much more robustly in 1979, pulling many other groups, many other offices from across the government into this umbrella agency called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which we call FEMA. That happened. And the first year or two, it's always hard because you don't have an agency. Nobody has expertise there because it's brand new. And so the first gentleman that was brought in was a famous sort of civil servant that had done all kinds of stuff in government and was basically not an emergency management expert, but more of an organizational guy, or more of a structural, knew how to stand up organizations and things like that. So he comes in, but then after he comes in, as we start to enter the 1980s, we start to get, and that's what I'm showing this turkey farm, which was the phrase used in a congressional sort of assessment, where it kind of became a political parking lot. One of your donors that wanted a job, but they weren't really good enough to be a ambassador somewhere, or wouldn't it was a place you could sort of park people, right? Put people there, and they have a government job, but they're not necessarily an expert, or they don't necessarily have a passion for a disaster response. So that was kind of messed up, and various things happened, but the biggest one probably was 1993, where when James Lee Witt is appointed, and he had run the Emergency Services Office in Arkansas, and he was really the first sort of modern, really disaster-focused organizational expert. He actually had a background in construction, but he essentially modernized it, and he really set off this modern course of the professionalization of FEMA, and try to address a lot of the shortcomings, because all these groups always have shortcomings. The next big thing is 9/11, which you guys won't remember. You're too young. But so 9/11, the world ended, and then and that was in 2001. In 2002, in early 2002, we passed a law, this Homeland Security Act, that sucked in all of these various entities across government that theoretically could help us defend if a terrorist attack was coming. And so all these disparate organizations came together under this umbrella of Homeland Security. FEMA goes under Homeland Security, and is pretty much ever since then, people have said this was a bad move, because FEMA is a relatively it gets lost in the national security establishment of Coast Guard and Border Patrol and all that kind of stuff. And so then we have, and we'll get to this when we talk about hurricanes, but basically Hurricane Katrina happened, and suffice it to say, it was a cluster F. It was not good. And not only was it initially bad, very, very, very clearly, FEMA's response was pathetic. FEMA's response was messed up. Famously, days as people were waiting in a major American city on a radio program, the head of Homeland Security, the reporter says, "Why are there still thousands of people in this convention center and Superdome and stuff? Why are these people here without water?" And this guy says, I don't have any reports of that." And he was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, have you not turned on the television the last day or last 2 days? You don't see the national broadcast of these grandmas passing away in the heat, and like, how can you possibly not know that there's people?" And then other things happen, which we'll talk about when we get to Hurricane Katrina. But very, very clearly, the folks that were at the high levels running FEMA were political appointees and not particularly adept at disaster management. And so then from there was some reorganization and stuff that came out of that. And I'm just noting here, one thing that we'll talk about in a second is Project 2025, which has become the blueprint, and FEMA entities play prominently in that. And then obviously President Trump was elected, and that's where the current deviations from norm have started. Why is this such an important thing? Well, we have a class on this. We're talking about this in our class, but separate from our class, just inherently, disasters are getting more problematic, right? So the frequency with which these things are happening, and then the toll with which they exact is going up. So this is a common data point that we've been using for the last several, at least the last decade, to describe major disasters. And so it's a bit arbitrary, but the notion is, hey, did this disaster cause at least $1 billion worth of damage? So if it costs $500 million, that's a huge disaster, but that doesn't trigger it, right? So it's a $1 billion disaster or more, to distinguish them from the relatively localized, relatively small-scale disasters. And so using this metric, which you can see here, and again, FEMA is established in 1979. So basically from the start of FEMA to now, what you essentially see is that curve is going up. So on the x-axis is time. On the left axis in blue with the blue bars is the number of events. And then on the right axis in the purpley maroon color, that's the estimated annual total cost of billion-dollar disasters that year. So that's not all the disasters added up. It's just the adding up the ones that were at least $1 billion. And the dots are the cost for the year, and then the curve is the best fit line. And so what we see there is stuff is going up. Very fortunately, last year, 2025, it wasn't as bad as the 2 previous years, but it's the 3rd worst on record, right? So we might have one year might be a little bit higher, one year might be a little bit lower, but the overall pattern is pretty clear. It's going up. Your federal government has deleted this database, so you cannot see this now. So now a nonprofit runs this. They apparently didn't want you to see this data because it's not convenient for them. Okay, so in the context of how we got to where we are, one of the big drivers was this thing called Project 2025, which was a governance document and sort of priority report, basically very detailed, very well researched, very well thought out. And from the Heritage Foundation, it's called Project 2025. You've probably heard of it. There's various aspects in there that were directed about hobbling the Federal Emergency Management Agency very specifically. So first and foremost, we'll go through this, but first and foremost, it's about shifting financial responsibility. So making the states pay for stuff. So the feds don't want to pay for disasters like they used to. 1, 2, they want to boost the aid threshold, which means if you lost your house or you lost your apartment, let's say, and because most of you guys are probably in apartments, you don't have a house, you don't have a mortgage and all this and that. So if the damage happens, you lose your stuff in your house, in your apartment, which sucks. But if it was your house, you'd lose all your stuff plus your garage and your property and the whatever, right? So a house that burns on average, or a homeowner that burns on average, is going to have, be a higher cost. And so they've increased the threshold as to where the federal aid will kick in. And so that has the effect of giving less money to poor folks and giving more money to, on average, wealthier folks because they're more likely to have more extensive damage and meet that threshold. There's a strong interest in privatizing things. So privatizing the national flood insurance, we'll talk about that later in the semester. And then in general, eliminating grants that are about helping people recover and or helping people get ready for the next disaster. And then things that aren't directly managed by FEMA, but that FEMA would facilitate, things like the Small Business Administration, which is one of the key players that comes in. FEMA helps coordinate them, but they provide, so if you had a barbershop or you had a restaurant, right, and the disaster comes through and you can't have customers, right, you need some financial help before the customers come back, before the building gets rebuilt or whatever, and the Small Business Administration is key for that, and so they would like to stop having small business loans. And then this interest in sort of having FEMA not be as prominent, move it to another agency where it doesn't have as much prominence, as much power, that kind of stuff. So they suggest perhaps the Department of Interior or the Department of Transportation. And again, I just want to say this is not normal. There are always political pressures on all these agencies, and that is normal. So sometimes a group comes into power and they are an advocate of this behavior or that, and they maybe give more money to this or less money to that. That is not what we're talking about. Let me be very, very clear. This is a wholesale changing of how the government works. This is not a little bit of difference of opinion. This is a different world. And so, in particular, Project 2025 really hates NOAA, probably because NOAA deals with climate change, and they think that's not real. And the National Weather Service they really don't like, and we'll get on to that later. But basically, some folks really think we should just privatize all the weather. So all the data that you pay for, the satellites, they want you to pay for it to put all the stuff up, and then they don't want you to see the data, which is why it's actually illegal for the National Weather Service to make a nice website. They want to make it very obscure for you to see, so you'll tend to go to a paying service that essentially does the same thing and gets all the data for free, but they'll charge you. And so So here's a quote from Project 2025. It says, NOAA should be dismantled and many of its functions eliminated, sent to other agencies, privatized, or placed under the control of states or territories. And so that's what I just said. So NOAA's they want to dismantle NOAA. At the same time, other things that will definitely impact our disaster world, as we will learn about this semester, are things that definitely play into disasters, but aren't necessarily housed within FEMA. And so that includes things like climate and environmental research and regulations that, let's say, make a disaster less likely to happen, right? Try to minimize climate change so we're not drying out as fast and being as prone to wildfires, things of that idea. Project 2025 is very clear about maximizing fossil fuel production. So that's what everything should be about. Dismantling all our clean energy incentives. And trying to hobble and eliminate whatever regulatory mechanisms exist. They don't believe climate change is a real thing. They do not see it as an urgent crisis at all. They talk about it as a quote-unquote perceived threat, and that folks like, let's say, us that work on perhaps a climate change capstone project or something, they refer to us as the alarmists or the alarm industry, that we're somehow creating stuff to do that stuff. Question, Caroline?
Talking about stuff that hasn't happened but they want it to happen. So like how close is this to being?
This is already happening.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go into examples in a second. This is my sort of like an intro slide. Yeah.
I noticed they, like, in an executive order to, like, with the whole, the leasing of the offshore
Right.
wind, they're like, oh, we're eliminating the verbiage, like, social cost of carbon.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that, like, what they're also talking about?
Absolutely.
Because it's, like, more of an abstract.
Well, I would say they would say it's abstract. It's
I feel like if you're talking about, like, social costs, like, it's, like, I feel like it might be harder to gather, like, oh, like, this square piece of area, like, burned because of this, like, company's, like, excess, like, carbon, like, output, but it's, like, it's more, like, non-point, and it's kind of, like, everywhere.
Yeah. So, for example, now again, I'm trying to stick to just disasters here because we could spend the whole semester talking about what's happening to environmental policy. But for example, the way the EPA has always calculated stuff. Hey, there's asbestos, right? Asbestos. We inhale asbestos, and then it messes up our lungs, and then we have breathing problems, and right, all that kind of stuff. And so in looking at what would be but of course, asbestos is in a lot of buildings and stuff. You can't just instantly snap your fingers. So we can't be silly folks and just say, oh, make it all go away, right? We have to make some kind of educated decision as to what is a dangerous level, what's an acceptable level. And the way we've gone about those types of calculations is to say, okay, say if we just left, let's say, asbestos in the walls, and we weren't we weren't renovating the building or something like that, like is that safe? And the answer is generally yes, as long as there's like an earthquake or a car crashes in the building and makes it all be rained down or whatever. It's like, okay, and then if we were to do some disturbance to this, is it worth the cleanup? And part of the calculation there is to say, if you were in the building or the folks in the neighborhood were in their neighborhood buildings, what's the probability they're going to inhale some of this asbestos just day-to-day life or dusty halls or something like that? And then we have some estimate of that, and we say, okay, how many folks would that tend to lead to a condition where they would actually start to have health effects, and then and we kind of run that through. And part of the calculation for that is always, hey, what is this going to do to people's health, and what is it going to do? And one of the clearest metrics that most folks used to want to see is the economic impact, right? So how many days off of work would this lead? How many disability? How people would have to go on disability because they couldn't work and all this and that. That is now, it's now policy. The EPA is not allowed to do that. The EPA is not allowed to talk about the economic impact of any regulation or whatever, which is nuts. It's just crazy.
The whole basis of, like, oh, we're gonna make the economy better, and then it's like,
Yeah,
well, where's the
I agree.
better?
I agree. So So again, this is the blueprint that's setting us up for what we'll talk about in a second. But so the blueprint says that federal climate change efforts in particular are in and of themselves economically detrimental to the United States of America. That's their thesis. That's their thesis. Other things that are, again, not exactly FEMA, but touch on this disaster, the disaster world, are things like environmental justice. And environmental justice doesn't so much get called out per se by itself, but it's definitely into the broader idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion elements which are considered bad, and that the whole of government needs to be oriented to not talk about this stuff, to ignore this, to ignore the communities that have a disproportionate pollution burden or are disproportionately exposed to, say, sea level rise risks, things of that nature. Okay. So next, what I want to do is run through some examples just to sort of give you guys the sense of what FEMA used to be like in historic times versus what's been going on in the last year. So what I'm going to do for these next few slides, on the left-hand side, I've put some stuff here, which would be, if I taught this class last year or the year before, the kind of stuff we'd talk about in this lecture. And so I think it is important you guys understand at least the way it used to be, even though it's not that way anymore, so that you have a sort of point of reference. Okay, so before this, the federal government broke up the U.S. into 10 different subregions. This is very common for agencies, right? They usually don't operate, 100% from Washington, D.C. It's Washington, D.C. is the mothership, or the national office is the mothership. And then most of the sort of more practical day-to-day stuff is done by these distributed centers. And so we have these 10 regions. For example, in fiscal year 2024, they had on the order of about 24,000 employees. A lot of those were contract employees, and they dispersed about $35 billion. I left off a parentheses there, and so that's about 0.5% of the federal budget. So a relatively small slice, but a very high-profile slice, right? When we have a disaster, when we have a hurricane, we have a wildfire, it's very much in people's faces and on the newspapers and stuff. The vast majority of that money was a throughput. So the vast majority of that money was not consumed by FEMA, but rather they dispersed that to local partners, and that's the way it's always been. So you give it to the county, you give it to the state, you give it to the city, whatever, and they do whatever it is, clean up or whatever. Okay. Where we are now, since January of 2025, there's a pretty active agenda following along the sort of initial roadmap from 2025 to dismantle FEMA, to sort of break up and begin to not use these agencies, regions, that kind of stuff. Insane turnover of leadership. We had 3 acting administrators in 1 year. I don't think we've ever had that, other than if somebody was out for, giving birth or something, and they stepped away. To have no leader, no identified, confirmed, head administrator has been weird for the majority of last year. Immediate staffing cuts was about 2,300 people, and that's about 10%, and that was in the first 6 months. But the widely stated goal is to have the number of folks that work at or for FEMA. In particular, this got really dramatic last month with the so-called core or the cadre of on-call respondents. And so these are the folks that mostly you would interact with. So if we're at the Woolsey fire, if we're at the Palisades fire, whatever, the folks that are actually there helping us with funding and helping us find a hotel room, or people like helping us do cleanup, like that type of folks. Most of those folks are these cadre of on-call responses. So they're on contract. So not a routine federal employee, but they would sign a contract for 24 months, 48 months, maybe it's not 48 months, but it's, for many months on end, and they're essentially on retainer and they're ready to go, so that when the thing happens, they relocate and they just go and they park there and they provide services to the community. It's also important to say that we haven't gone through our first big disaster yet in this class, but we are a bit weird here in Southern California, right? We're a wealthy state. We have a very strong government. We have very robust Office of Emergency Services. We have a lot of stuff here in our state. Many states are not like that. They don't have the money. They don't have the institutional support. And so FEMA is helpful all over the place, but it's most dramatically helpful, in my experience, in more rural communities that are less, advantaged, that kind of stuff. And so these folks, whereas, so if something happened in California, it would still be expensive, but somehow we have enough bodies here that somebody could surge in and help. If you're in the middle of, I don't know, Arkansas, rural Louisiana, like not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. And this group was one of the ones. Now this was the source of a huge consternation, and people just the folks that were their supervisors that said, oh my gosh, these people are absolutely fundamental to what we do, and we need to have them ready in case there's a hurricane, in case there's a wildfire, in case there's a tornado, whatever. They started filling out their paperwork to rehire them, which is a normal thing. And all of them were told, no. It has to be approved by the Secretary of Homeland Security personally. And they're like, wait, this is like thousands of people. What do you mean personally approved? I'm like, yep, that's how it's going to go. So it got super crazy. That was just paused a couple weeks ago. And they're like, no, I guess we should have that go. But there was a massive uproar. Who knows? But it sort of seemed like if there wasn't a massive uproar, that maybe just would have kept going. And so all this has the effect of a major brain drain. Whereas historically, people always retire. People always get old and age out and stuff. But for the most part, people that are involved with FEMA are, not everybody, but a large fraction of them really feel it as a calling, right? It's like a medical doctor, a firefighter, like, dude, I do this, yeah, I get paid or whatever, but I really have a passion for helping people or whatever. And so there tends to be a lot of people stay from year to year to year. That has changed. There's this massive exodus going on with people with really solid experience and knowledge. And so it's turning into something of a brain drain. This cartoon here says at the bottom, it says, I didn't know there was a hurricane season. That was one of the acting administrators said that. And then when he got called on it, he's like, oh, no, I was just kidding. That's what these guys always seem to say. They always say outlandish stuff. And then when you call them out, like, oh, no, how could you think I'd think that?
And Professor, the directors are usually appointed, or are they like?
Yes, so they're nominated by the executive branch, and then they're confirmed by Congress. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So all right. So then we have one of the key things that FEMA does is they help with preparedness and training, not just their federal cohorts, but state agency folks as well. Hey, how do we go about doing earthquake response? How do we go about, if there were to be an earthquake, how do we, what do we do, right? So there's classes you can take, there's trainings you can go to, all that kind of stuff. And so EMI is the Emergency Management Institute, which is sort of a clearinghouse for how we go about doing stuff related to FEMA. CDP is the Center for Domestic Preparedness, where we're trying to prepare for the next disaster. And those guys, again, this is before last year, are training somewhere on the order of at least 70,000 people a year, if not significantly more. So it's a lot of training, a lot of opportunities for learning, and therefore bolstering our disaster response. BRIC, which we'll come back to, is the Building Resilience Infrastructure in Communities. It's a grant program. This was launched in 2020, so this wasn't something that was around for decades and decades, but really about trying to boost resilience and help us with being more steeled against sea level rise, wildfires, stuff like that. And they distribute about $4.5 billion between about 2020 and 2024. Other offices are putting out, hundreds of millions of dollars to, again, mostly local, state, and local entities. We have various groups within FEMA that help pass out information, like the national level exercise, which is like a one exercise that FEMA runs and other people participate in. They kind of see how, sort of role play and see how the disaster would play out, how they can get better, all that kind of stuff. And in general, FEMA was really one of their main focuses of this type of stuff in the preparedness and training world was to really try to professionalize emergency management and make sure that we're everybody has the same standard, everybody has the same expectation, we all use a unified command, stuff like that. Since January of last year, training has been one of the first things targeted for downsizing, and we don't need to do training anymore. We don't need to do preparation, or certainly not the levels that we were historically doing it. The BRIC funding was just canceled without, again, as with so many things, not like announce that we're going to cancel it, just one day decide we're just not going to pay it. Even after they were already awarded and people were expecting the money, we decided we're not going to give it to you. And so that was most recently ruled, a judge has found in December that was illegal, but the Trump administration is appealing that. So it's still crazy. And several states, including our state, sued when that happened. So they were part of the plaintiffs saying, you can't just give us money and then suspend it. And there's a big push to have all the responsibility done by the states. Right? So just don't be that backbone, don't be that backstop to help everybody have the same standards of recovery, but just let everybody do it on their own.
Professor,
yeah.
At any point, do our people that are training are called like internationally, or?
Oh yeah, totally, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so FEMA historically, I don't think anymore, but historically FEMA works with Australia. Like one of the famous things that we do in Australia and California, right? We're in different hemispheres. So for our firefighters, our seasonal wildfires, and sometimes our firefighting aircraft, for example, will send, when it's our winter time, it's their summertime. And so they're more likely to have fires. And so we send down either teams or we send down equipment, and they're there for the season, and then vice versa. And so there's that level that goes on. There's also just coordination meetings. So we'll have a couple weeks ago we had a delegation from, I don't remember where they were from, maybe Australia, I don't remember, sort of come around, turn around, looking at see how we're doing stuff. And in some cases it's like, they're like, why aren't you guys doing it this way? We're like, oh damn, that's a good idea, we should do it. In other cases like, oh my gosh, you guys are doing that really well, we want to mimic that. So both on the sort of first responder kind of level, but also in like the administrative planning, that absolutely happens. Okay. Then we have the mitigation and resilience aspect of stuff. In the most immediate couple years, some of the studies have found that I mentioned that other one that was like over the last 80 years, 150 to 300% return on investment. More recently, it seems to be higher than that. So in recent years, the investments we've made seem to be saving us even more money. So on the order of like $6 for every dollar we invest. Again, then before times we'd be doing flood maps, supporting seismic retrofitting, all that kind of stuff, getting us ready to be more resilient before the disaster hits. And by, as of 2024, dealing with climate change, understanding climate change, what it's going to do to heat waves and all this kind of stuff, how first responders might have to deal with hotter conditions when they're fighting fires and rescuing people in earthquakes and things of that nature. That was fully baked into FEMA's everything at that point. Now where we are is the FEMA has now rescinded the most recent flood standards, saying where is safe to build relative to rivers, et cetera. I have a lot of critique for how FEMA has done stuff before. I'm not trying to imply to you all that FEMA was perfect in 2024. I am not saying that at all. But there are ways to improve things, and there are ways to improve things. And simply deleting the entire project is, I would say, not the most efficient way to get us to a better thing. So by removing those flood standards, they're basically, yeah, you want to go build in a hazard zone, go for it, right? Go for it. Similarly, sea level rise, which is even more closely tied to climate change, that thing, the sea level rise guidance, that's all removed. So sure, go ahead, put your new power plant right, 1 foot above sea level on the beach. That's fine. And as I mentioned before, the higher thresholds for what triggers you getting money from FEMA is shifting the beneficiaries to higher income communities. Okay. In terms of how we actually respond, in terms of how we actually do a disaster. We'll talk about this more in a future class, but basically, to get federal money, we have to have what's known as a federally declared disaster area. We have a similar process in the state of California, and indeed most states, if it's just state. And if the disaster is only within California and doesn't not massive scale, the governor can declare a state disaster area or a state disaster county, and then that's the mechanism then to open up sort of statewide funding. Same with the federal level. So essentially what happens is we have to have a so-called federal disaster declaration, and when that's declared, then that opens the floodgates. And so before, if we talk about, say, 2024, 2023, we're having an average of 50 to 60-ish federal disaster declarations a year. And so that's, on average, one a week, less than one a week. And usually those are coordinated. So it's not as if, like, you're applying to a competitive grant. I, at FEMA, know you're hurting, and so I'm going to, hey, so you probably want to ask for cleanup money, right? Yeah, cool. And you probably want to ask for horse paddock stuff because you have a bunch of horse ranches here, right? You want to make sure you have large animal vets, and and so it's a collaborative thing, and then you work on it together, or the FEMA folks provide support for you, and then the state actually submits it, and then the president is the entity that actually says yes, I approve whatever you said. Sometimes there's some error in the paperwork and stuff, but for the most part, it's like, yes, federal, and then that's the mechanism to start to release the federal funding. It's insane what's happening right now. So whereas one a week or whatever, before, now it's taking an average of over a month to get a average disaster declaration approved. Very long. We've had 16 requests denied, and most of those appear to be denied purely for partisan reasons. Statements like, well, these people didn't vote for me. There's none of my voters there. I mean, this is nuts. This is not professional. This is not a democracy. This is not how people are hurting. Doesn't matter if they're rich, poor, up, down, right, left, whatever. Like, these folks are hurting. Let's get these folks some help. That is not how we do things now. And as of when I was putting this together the other day, we have 18 pending requests, which is a lot. I don't ever remember being that high. Yeah, okay, cool. And then what we're actually starting to see now is when we have some of these disasters, we're not seeing FEMA show up, which is bizarre. Again, bizarre in the context of the historic approach to managing disasters. Okay, we'll do one or two more of these, and we'll take a little break. So then we're on to the recovery. So we've had the problem, we've had the thing, and now we're working on recovery. Okay, so in Iowa, we pump out money sometimes. Depending on the situation, to maybe not a huge amount, depending on the scale of the disaster. In an example from Pennsylvania, the vast majority of funding to FEMA funds to that state were for large-scale things you would suspect, like fixing roads, clearing debris, that kind of stuff. The National Flood Insurance Program, which Again, there's lots of issues with this. There's a lot of problems with it, but suffice it to say, there were on the order of about 5 million policies, and these are for folks that can't get flood insurance through other, like regular insurance things. Usually it's because they're in a risky area. And about $70 billion has been paid out through that mechanism. And when we have these programs and everything, things are being monitored to make sure we're doing it efficiently and all that kind of good stuff. Now, DHS, which again is the parent entity for FEMA, has withheld, the most recent news stories say about $11 billion in pandemic reimbursements. So these are things from COVID that states made investments in with the idea that then FEMA, when they were done with the project, then FEMA would reimburse them. They again just decided to say, nah, we're not going to give you that money, right? Completely nuts. $900 billion in rebuilding grants have been paused that say they all have to be approved by Secretary Noem. There's about $17 billion that are sort of sitting in limbo that haven't technically been canceled, but they're not going forward. I mean, these are massive, massive amounts of money. And so states just, I mean, again, we're a relatively wealthy state, and this is pretty close to impossible for us. You can imagine if you're a lower income state, like it just nothing's happening. Just nothing's happening. Okay. So and then we can talk about the overall big picture, like the like not the crisis day to day or the immediate response or whatever, but like where are we going as an entity, as an organization? And so we've seen a couple different eras where FEMA and this sort of federal response has evolved and has changed pretty substantial, had some serious sort of inward looking and revision to how they went and did stuff. One of those was the end of the Soviet Union. A lot of the early 1980s and stuff, FEMA was about surviving nuclear war. And how are we going to evacuate all these people from our cities before we get blown up? I mean, all crazy talk, right? But nevertheless, that sort of Cold War mentality. So when the Cold War ended, there was a big pivot where, hey, we're not so much worried about us slaughtering each other with nuclear bombs. We should really be oriented around earthquakes, around volcanoes, around heat stress, that kind of stuff. So that was the first one. Second one was after Katrina, after all the crazy things that happened with Katrina. We got to do things better. And then COVID. Now, while the Cold War was a sort of, okay, this event happened, let's look back on what we do. Katrina was, okay, this was an event, we did it poorly, let's look back, how can we do it better? COVID was actually evolving in real time. So COVID, because obviously it wasn't just a discrete event, it lasted for a long time, years, right? FEMA was adapting and doing a lot of that response, during then. There's a lot of burnout, and so people were just, particularly after COVID, people were just really exhausted, and so we're already having some long-term staffing gaps, and we've done various reforms at various times. But in general, I think the main strategic view of FEMA before 2025 was the whole community. We're all doing this together. We're all going to be treating hurricanes as hurricanes, whether they're in Louisiana or Florida or wherever. Now, a lot of this got kicked off with executive orders from the president, and those refer to things like the primacy of the state. So the state should do all the work. The state should be the main responders. The state should have all the resources. The state should be the main actors, which is kind of bizarre because the states already are, and FEMA is more like the backbone helping them. It's not as if we have this giant, separate government that comes in from the feds. It's a collaborative thing. And then almost all the planning units, the units for climatological stuff and geological hazards and those kinds of things, they've pretty much all been gutted now. All the climate-related stuff has been pulled out. And so that means that when we have a disaster that comes in and we're vulnerable and we have some problems, and then we're like, okay, we survived, or folks that survived. Now we're going to build back. Hey, let's build back with the awareness of climate change. So we're more resilient when that wildfire or whatever comes through. Nope, just go ahead and put it just in harm's way. An insane waste of money and energy and time and everything. As I mentioned, huge leadership turmoil, and that's clearly leading to intellectual memory and institutional memory just being gone. And a recent poll that just came out a couple weeks ago basically said that trust in FEMA has been declining over this past, it started declining around COVID, right? COVID, it started taking hits, but really it's taken a tumble in this last year, and now that level is below what it was in like sort of the Katrina era, which is not good. So most people don't seem to have faith. So we'll do this last slide, and then we'll take a pause. So what we're seeing in not just with our disaster, but with other stuff in the federal government, but we're basically seeing shifts in decision making and how we do this, right? It used to be, again, the post-World War II norm was, what's your evidence? Show me the numbers. What's the measurement? What's the accounting? You know, how many folks passed away or whatever. Now it's much more personality from the folks at the top. And this notion of, well, we just do this by common sense and gut instinct. And so one of the many quotes that the president has said is, I have a gut, and my gut tells me more sometimes than anybody else's brain can ever tell me. That's the opposite of expertise. That's the opposite of objective reality. That's just saying I do whatever I feel like, and that makes me smarter, which is just very disappointing. And then related to that, I mean, separate from that, but another key thing is also the democratic norms and the democratic structures that would rein in some people's maybe, you know, most craziest tendencies or whatever. Those are rapidly vanishing. So we're using the Department of Justice for personal retribution, and we're talking about crime emergencies, whereas we used to talk about disaster emergencies. Now we're talking about crime emergencies of all these bad people doing supposedly bad things that are political in nature. And the Supreme Court, 2 summers ago, basically said the president has absolute immunity when he's acting in his official capacity or her official capacity. So that means all these things we're talking about, they're essentially no or very few checks and balances and historical breaks.
Are we seeing any hope on like state and county levels? I mean, like with like the seismic retrofitting, like I feel like LA still wouldn't allow, you know, like they still have their own standards for mitigating things. So
yeah, so one of the questions is, hey, if we're seeing this change, there's this radical change at one level of government, can other levels of government respond and sort of backfill or provide some kind of counterweight? To an extent, sure, but only to an extent. Again, when we have almost a century of tradition built up that we have this level and this level and this level working together, we've just never had the case where suddenly the legs are pulled out from part of those stools. So sometimes the stool doesn't tip over. Sometimes it's still there. But in other cases, it looks like the local government or the state or whomever has some policies in place, but they're not. It's not the same thing. So I'll give you an example. An example would be wetlands. So one of the ways that we manage wetlands for most of the U.S. is with essentially with some old law that had to do with how water moves around the surface of the earth. And so one of the terms is navigable waters. And so if it was potentially so the idea was, here we have a wetland over here, this pond over here, and it's protected because it's a quote unquote navigable water, or it's part of this a watershed, and so therefore we've decided that it's part of the stream, and so therefore you can't mess it up, and it's protected by some of the provisions, usually something like Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. It's like, okay, cool. Two summers ago, I can't remember, 2 or 3 summers ago, the Supreme Court said, nope, that's not the right interpretation. So instantly, 1/2 of all the wetlands in the United States of America lost legal protection. When I was at University of Utah last spring giving a departmental seminar, I went with my friend's conservation biology class to their what would be the equivalent? It would be like kind of like MODOC, kind of like MODOC Hall. And they were talking about a small group that's growing plants to help with wetland restorations. And this greenhouse was about the size of your guys' classroom, maybe 2 classrooms. That was the largest native plant nursery for wetland plants in the entire state of Utah. Many of the folks talk about how once that ruling came in, now these folks that had like a depressional wetland on their property, now it's like they just all bulls it over, filled it in, right? That kind of stuff. And so that's in, for example, Utah. So you might say, so the question might be, hey, in California, but we have stronger wetland protection laws, right? So theoretically, yeah, we have state laws that say you can't mess with wetlands, theoretically that are separate from the federal, but we've relied on the federal for all of the enforcement and all this kind of stuff. So I should be careful because this is not trying to be political, but a local city has a large wetland, and it's in California. So you're like, hey, wetland, right? So should be protected. When that ruling happened, the guy was trying to develop the property and sort of build, obliterate the wetland and do stuff. And it got, once that ruling came into being, high power, full board. The lawyers come out, yeah, so we're going to start building. Hey, yeah, you guys, we just want to work. We want to make housing, right? Doesn't California need more housing? That kind of stuff. We do need housing. We should have more housing. But I don't think building in a floodplain is the best answer for that. And so it's a great example. You might think that our laws would sort of kick in, but they don't always. Or when they do, we just don't have the staff to manage the entire, or to enforce that law. So yeah. Cool? All right, I want to take a quick 10-minute stretch, and we'll come back and pick this up where we have left off. It would not be approved. And then if you came out and gave that presentation, you could be fired. Straight up. So colleagues I know, I should be careful what I say here. How do I say this?
You have
No. So some of the people in agencies have been fired because of emails. Some of people in agencies that I know had their private phone records gone through because at some point they texted from their personal cell, as we all probably do sometimes, like, oh, hey, I sent it, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, that was deemed government speech, and so then they got access to the entirety of their communication logs. So it's not about me protecting my free speech. It's about making sure my colleagues are not, I don't unintentionally out a colleague.
Isn't there like federal funding for that kind of research though? Like how does that work if they're not even allowed to talk about the findings of their research, but they're being funded?
So what we're learning is that we have the law, and then we have norms of behavior. And for the most part in our history of our country, modern history of our country, people follow the law. And that a lot of this was just folks believing in the importance of following the law, even when we disagreed about something, right? I think what we're seeing here with, we just talked about all these grants, right? Just suspending these grants. It's like, it's not illegal. It's, in my understanding, it's illegal when you sign a contract with someone and nobody has violated the terms that you give them the stuff. Same thing. Like, how can they do that? Ain't nobody holding them accountable, is the answer. And so our government was designed to have checks and balances. When you don't have the checks and balances, just because we have a law, not everybody follows the law. I think that's again, not trying to be political, but just objectively, that seems to be what's going on.
Does that go for like all these agencies, like public published work, or just that like the work that goes to like the federal level?
Wait, so ask me again. I'm not understanding the question.
Like if they can't tell the public like this is a climate crisis, like they can't say that.
That's right. Well, I mean, they could, and then if they were to say that, they would be very quickly put on. Well, it seems likely they would be put on administrative leave. I don't know, but that's happened so far last year, and that was an excuse to put someone on administrative leave. And then as we reviewed them, and then you know what, you violated the policy. We're just going to let you go. So, yeah, I mean, they're treating it as if you. They're treating it as if you, said a discriminatory thing to someone, or physically attack someone, or they're like, "Whoa, you can't do that. We need to go through our policies and say you can't do X, Y, and Z." And because that's now the executive policy. Again, this is different from all of the history of civil servant engagement, all kinds of. Somebody else had a question.
What about university level research?
Yeah, 7 of my grants have been cut. So our disaster response stuff, some of you guys helped us, which is great. We had 40 of you guys signed up, and then because that funding was cut at the last minute by the federal, we had 12 people help with that project. I mean, that's but one example. We can complain and scream and whatever, but the fact is no money, right? And when we were trying to help those folks this summer, they needed help this summer. They didn't need help like 3 years from now or whatever if you kind of sued somebody and got some money or something. So, yeah, okay, cool. So if you guys are curious, you can look up, so this is the federal, the EDGI, which is a crowdsourced effort to try to track government websites that have been altered and changed, and trying to archive them, so you can go check out some of that. Again, that's a small fraction of all the changes, but at least you can begin to get sort of a sense as to what has been the priority of trying to suppress data and take away data from the public. Okay, we're also seeing a retreat from this whole idea of mitigation to mitigate the disaster. And so, first and foremost, FEMA's strategic plan, which is essentially their marching orders, their goals to themselves. Like, how are we gonna deal with disasters when disasters are going on, right? And so they yanked it back in 2025, and then just haven't had anything since, which is pretty crazy to think that. It's not like what typically would happen if we had some hiccup or some funding thing or something. We'd like, okay, we're just going to keep using the old guidelines until we get the new guidelines. These guys just deleted all the guidelines. Again, purely from an organizational standpoint, having nothing to do with the disaster, that seems kind of crazy. If you were a box delivery company and you had your plan for delivering boxes, you would probably keep that plan until you got your new box delivery plan. You wouldn't just suddenly blast it out and then months later not have a plan for how you can deliver your boxes, right? The BRIC funding I mentioned is crazy. 720 million were going to Louisiana, where some places we work, and then 870 million were coming to California. especially places like larger cities, Oakland and LA and things like that. Again, as I mentioned before, that's that brick thing, and that was found by a judge to be the suspension of that funding illegal, but now the Trump administration is appealing that decision, so it's still in something of a legal limbo. Okay, and then the famous abolishing FEMA internal memo, which came out in March, basically said, again, the federal aid should be for, we should only do big things. We should only do big major things. And this is a quote from the president of the U.S. Council of International Association of Emergency Managers, not part of FEMA, right? Not, just to be clear, this is just commenting in a news story. Basically said, so in terms of interpreting that memo, was that you should not expect to see FEMA on the ground unless it's like a massive, massive disaster, basically, which, again, very different from the past. When we talk about disasters of our own making through like disease and things of that nature, and international perspectives, we're going to focus mostly on the U.S. in this class. We will touch on international stuff, but mostly just for time, we're going to focus on the U.S. But suffice it to say, just the other week, 2 weeks ago, it was announced that we were pulling out from, it's more than 60, I think it's at least 65 international organizations, including the World Health Organization, the IPCC, all these multinational bodies we're pulling out of. It was announced, one of the first things President Trump did when he came into office, he announced we're pulling out of the Paris Agreement, the climate accords, but it takes 1 year for that to go into effect, so that just went into effect. And so now we're one of 4 countries in the world that are not a party to the Paris Agreement. Again, lots of issues. I had lots of issues with the Paris Agreement, but at least it's a mechanism to be engaged. So we joined the lofty heights of Yemen, Libya, and Iran. Excellent. And then, of course, there's the whole international humanitarian costs. A lot of this stuff stemming from the termination of USAID by DOGE, and then eventually its complete elimination by the State Department. One classic example is when there was this earthquake several months ago in Afghanistan. We just didn't do anything. Unheard of. We eventually, after a few weeks, sent a couple $1 million. I mean, nothing like we have in the past. And there are many estimates. They're all over the board, but just picking one, if we talk about the suspension, and so one of the things USAID does, not just help with food and stuff like that, but also with health-related spending on countries that don't have maybe as robust a healthcare system, et cetera. And the estimates are we're probably going to see about 1.2 million additional child deaths because of the lack of vaccinations that aren't going to happen because we're not funding it, and other countries are not stepping in. So all that kind of stuff. The war on science right now is continuing, so that the efforts to sort of defund are ongoing. In addition to like the agencies not getting funded, as I mentioned, some of our grants have been suspended here. UCLA, UC San Diego, Harvard, all those guys are both having their grants suspended or had their grants suspended, as well as they're being extorted. There's no other word for it, right? So the answer is you have to pay millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into a fund to support the president's priorities, and then they'll give you your grant money. I mean, it's mafioso stuff. I mean, it's pretty insane. Another thing that and again, these folks are very smart. Don't think these folks are just totally silly folks. They've thought very clearly how to pour as much syrup and sugar in the gas tanks of disasters and science as possible. So one of the things they've done is they've increased, this sounds totally boring and like, oh God, I'll try every time this, but they've reduced the so-called indirect cost rate. So when I write a grant, let's say the grant is $100,000. So that's what I need to pay you to pay for transportation, whatever it is. It can cost $100,000, right? But when I actually write the grant, it's going to be for more than that. So it's going to be the costs of what we need to do our research, and then the so-called indirect rate. And so that's what your institution charges. And so that's what's known as a federally negotiated overhead rate. And so it's going to depend. Ours is about 50%, meaning if we decide that we need $100,000 to do our work, we have to write the grant for $150,000. And this is all set up ahead of time. So this is all a standard agreement. Every university has an individual agreement with the federal agencies. So this is all worked out, well ahead of time. And so, like at Stanford, we had 100% overhead. So at Stanford, if it was $100,000 to do my work, I'd have to write a grant for $200,000. And that overhead helps to keep. I know you guys don't believe this, but helps keep tuition a little bit lower for you. Pays for the building lights, pays for the phone in the lab, and all the infrastructure you need to run, the sort of organization. And so they've now lowered that from, which is typically around 50-ish%. It'll vary depending on the institute, but typically around 50% to down around 15%. So that's enough that major folks doing cancer trials and things like that, they're just stopping doing research. They just can't. The universities can't function with that. So this is a backdoor way of shutting down research, basically. And then, of course, there's the active dismissal of experts. So in April alone, the National Climate Assessment, which is done every few years, it's an all-of-government approach where folks work on what's going on with climate change, health, wildfires, all different kinds of stuff. It's just been terminated. So more than 400 folks have been let go that were involved with that process. Federal government-wise, it's about 20, compared to this time last year, about 25,000 fewer scientists and environmental experts are employed by the federal government. So that's pretty crazy. And then there's just the economic realities, right? Which is that as I mentioned before, these disasters are getting more and more expensive, and so we need, as an adult, as the adults in the room, we need to understand what's going on. We need to be able to forecast, measure, adapt. And so as we gut our ability to understand what's happening to us, there's no way we can be as good a responder. We just can't, right? We don't have the information, we don't have the facts. There's been a dramatic renewable energy whipsaw. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act that provided this huge amount of influx of funding for all kinds of stuff, including, amongst other things, cleaner energy stuff, windmills, solar panels, stuff like that. Much of that has been frozen. Not all, but much of it has been frozen. The cheapest electricity right now on the planet is wind and solar by far. Those are the things that could be supplying the AI data centers, et cetera. We're being disallowed from using those, and we're being told to use the most expensive, most polluting forms of energy. Pretty crazy. And that's leading to, amongst other things, higher energy bills. Okay, so a little bit of that stuff. Now I want to play for you guys this. So this is... I can share for you the raw video. The whole thing is about an hour. Not going to watch the whole thing. But I just took about 10 minutes of this as one example as to how this stuff is manifesting. Again, I'm not trying to be political. I do not want to be political. I'm not trying to attack somebody politically. I'm just talking about, as a scientist, as a disaster person, how this is playing out. So what this is a live feed from about a year ago. The Palisades fire and Eaton fires had just happened, and the new president was coming through and was checking stuff out. So earlier in the day had gone to North Carolina, where there was also some horrible flooding, and then came and committed to come to Eaton, which tends to be lower income, more working class folks, more diverse community, and Palisades. Shocker, time things gets messed up. That almost always happens with presidents. And they're busy people and all that kind of stuff. So could only go to one place, so went to Palisades, right? And Palisades should get the president's attention, absolutely, but I think maybe other places should too. So there he did a press conference. And so what I'm going to show you is just a couple minute excerpt from it. But what I've done is I've overlaid the reality as to what is going on. But this just gives you a sense of the challenges we face in trying to have facts and reality dealing with fire stuff. So I'm just going to play this for you guys.
Thing would be great. For a building permit, you're going to have to, check things out a little bit. A lot of them, every single one of them said they're going to rebuild. I didn't have one person say they're selling or they're leaving or they're disgusted. They love their community, and it's incredible. We even had one from your neck of the woods, right? Yeah. Do you want to stand up? It was so nice the way she greeted my wife in a very different language, right? And it was very nice to see. And you're staying and you're going to rebuild and everything else. Yeah, everybody. So it's really good. So I'm signing an executive order to open up the pumps and valves in the north. We want to get that water pouring down here as quickly as possible and let hundreds of millions of gallons of water flow down into Southern California. And that'll be a big benefit to you. If you don't want it, you're going to tell me, but I can't imagine it. I tell you who does like it is the fire department. When I said that, they were very happy with that. They didn't mind hearing that. But we have a lot of water that is available. And I hope you can work that out among yourselves. But I think this will show that we have to have that water. We have to have that water. You're talking about unlimited water coming up from the Pacific Northwest, even coming up from parts of Canada. And it pours down naturally. It has for a million years. For a million years, it pours down. You'll never run out. You'll never have shortages, and you won't have things like this. And when you do, you'll have a lot of water to put it out. So I'm going to ask that you figure that out. But I really strongly recommended this 7 years ago, and I think I'm going to just do it. If you have big problems, you're going to let me know, but I just can't even imagine it. But we're also surging federal resources and assistance to the state, and California must adopt the common sense policies to prevent fires, and we all know that. We were talking 7 or 8 years ago, I was talking to people from Austria, people from Finland, people that live in forests. One of the gentlemen, one of the top great leaders of Austria said, we don't have forest fires, and we have trees that are actually far more flammable than they have in California, but they literally rake their forests. They take down, if a tree comes down, they take it down. They say you have 18 months. After that, it's like a matchstick. And I know environmentally, some environmental groups like the trees to just melt into the ground, but when they do melt into the ground, they become an inferno. So I think you're going to have to change your ways in terms of that. You have 30 years of leaves, and those leaves are dry as a bone, and they burn. Interestingly, because I was at Paradise, who is the general, right? A long time ago, I was at Paradise. What a beautiful paradise it was. And how is it doing, by the way? Are they rebuilding, right? Remember when he said, you were up here, President. I went there. I never saw anything like it. But you know what amazed me? I'll never forget it. The trees were okay because the trees are loaded with water. They sucked that water out of the ground. And this was an inferno, just like, I would say no different than this. And it was also the wind that caused a lot of problem. I mean, you had tremendous winds that there's not a lot you're going to do with. You had up to 100-mile-an-hour winds. It's unheard of. But when I was in Paradise, I noticed that the trees, they were dark on the bottom, but they were absolutely living, and they lived because they're soaking wet. But the trees that were on the ground, within 12 to 18 months, they say 18 months at a maximum, you have to cut them up, take them away because they're matchsticks. But we saw that. You saw that with me. I commented at the time. I said, look at this. The house is burned down, and the tree is standing, and it's, other than being a little different color on the bottom, and it went through an inferno. It's amazing. It's soaking wet. So I think they have to do it. It's called management of the floor. And when the gentleman from Austria and also Finland and other countries, they said we manage the forest floor very, very carefully, and we don't have forest fires. They just don't have them. So I'm sure you're going to do the same thing.
Okay, so
Thing would be.
So yeah, I mean, much of what was said there is just doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. And that was, again, a year ago before things started to get as intense and as pointed as they unfortunately have become. So, we need to be able to talk to each other. We need to be able to have honest conversations and hear one another. But at the same time, we also need to say, the problem isn't the problem was not water in the Palisades. The problem is 100-year-old water systems that were not built to be turned on all the time and have water flooding out continuously. There is no water that flows down from Canada that comes to us. Unfortunately, saying such stuff leads us to bad management decisions and leads to people losing things and losing their lives and livelihoods, and it's just messed up. So, okay, so one of the challenges that we're losing with this kind of stuff is this shared reality, right? When we used to have disasters, that's where folks kind of came together. And yeah, there's this problem with the bureaucracy of getting the housing permits, and there's this and that, but for the most part, folks were all in this together. Now, because of we're so politicized, and people's willingness to politicize even things like disasters, it's becoming very hard to have a concrete discussion about stuff. This disinformation, all this stuff is going on. There's just a lot of craziness going on. On top of all that stuff, with our country with a number of people in it, with our planet with a number of people in it, not seeing reality, not responding to the threats objectively and responsibly and with facts strikes me as suicidal, because we're not magically going to get better. It's just we're going to be magically more vulnerable, and I hope we're not vulnerable. Okay, so to review all this stuff, just real quick, the stuff that FEMA traditionally has done is stuff like create a nationwide orientation, a nationwide focus on dealing with disasters, helping us with preparedness and programs, both for the federal levels and for state and local professionals. And then once we do have a bad event, a thing happen, help us with mitigation for that, and then be more resilient for the next thing that would come down along. And then when the actual event happens, the actual crisis, helping facilitate the actual response, in the hours and days in the immediate wake of the event. And then once that immediate people are saved, et cetera, and we pivot to the recovery phase, helping out with that phase as well. And this stuff that we're seeing again is not typical politics. This is not I have a disagreement with my friend and we see things differently. This is a fundamental departure for how we go about doing governance and stewardship and emergency management. And this seems, and these things, we just touched on all these things, but these are all elements of what's going on. Questions? Yes, Dan.
What are you? I mean, the administration is going to change, hopefully. Like, how much work would be involved in putting all this back together? Like, is it getting taken down to a point where it's going to be so hard to rebuild, to refund, to replenish those, like?
Great question. So the question is, hey, so if there is all this deviation from the norm, are we going to be able to go back to the norm, anytime soon? I don't know, right? If I knew, I could bet on it and I could win the Super Bowl this weekend, next weekend or whatever. But I don't know, and I suspect if you asked some of your other ESRM faculty members, you get different answers. From the folks I interact with, I don't think. I think we've entered a different era. I don't think things are going to swing back. Certainly not the way they used to be. I mean, in the case of things like basic research funding, the contract, the social contract that we had with our country and stuff is broken. So a lot of people I know are leaving universities, and people are leaving the country. They're doing research in Europe and China and places like that because they're like this, you know, you can no longer rely, you know, so it's like thinking that your parents' room is perfect and you know, nothing would ever go wrong in your parents' room. And then some thief breaks in and steals some jewelry. Like, oh my gosh, now I see my parents' room as vulnerable, or now I don't see it in quite the same way. So we'll see. But I think that a lot of this stuff is really about trust. And I think there's been a lot of broken trust. And I think more so than the policies and stuff, we have to be able to just talk with one another and be in the same spaces together. And just because, you know, Team A or Team B wins and they, you know, go do something, I don't see it as changing quickly. I mean, I probably could be wrong. But those are my sentiments. Cool. Other questions on this happy talk?
I saw that California joined the World Health Organization, or like was a part of the network.
Yeah.
What does that mean for us, and was it hard to do, and like do you think other states would follow us?
Yeah, so the question is, so if we have, say, some of these international conventions or international groups, and if our larger entity has either removed itself or is not a member, can you know, smaller scale groups join? Could be a state, could be a county, sometimes could be a nonprofit, something like that. Absolutely, that can happen. And I think that's sort of a psychological boost and that kind of good stuff. And it's also the fact that California is one of the largest economies in the world. So just simply ourselves, we just have a lot of momentum. That, let's say if we were, you know, Idaho or something, we wouldn't have that much momentum. It wouldn't punch as hard. So in one sense, we have that, quote unquote, going for us. But the reality is, it's not the same as the full governance of a country behind you. You know, so Professor Kefala is in a UN convention right now. She's coming back in a day or a couple days. You should track her down and poke her brain, you know, pick her brain in, you know, a week or two after she's caught up on sleep or whatever, and just sort of see her sense. She's in the international negotiations right now, and I think she's finding it a little bit of frustration.
On
Right?
that point, she should be getting back next week on Tuesday, and her class, for us at least, is at 6 to 8 o'clock, essentially.
Yeah.
On Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Totally.
So if you want to see her, that's
Totally.
It felt like it used to be that like federal jobs were secure, or that you could just retire into them. So do you think it's beneficial for us to look more into like county jobs or California EPA, more like state and county and city jobs instead of following?
Great question. Again, I wish I had guidance for you guys. This is the least certain I've been in my 35 years of teaching and advising young folks in terms of jobs. I think for the short term, I don't think for the kind of stuff you guys do, the kind of stuff we do, of course there might be an opportunity, and if there's an opportunity, you should totally, you know, throw your application in. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of job prospects at the federal level, and that's by design. That's so part of this is also to freak you guys out. So part of this whole strategy is to make you all depressed and make you feel hopeless and make you feel like, oh, you know, it's all, you know, yeah, there's nothing to do.